Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Muñiz.
Welcome, everyone. We are excited to be back on our Psych AMC Psych outline. Today, we are past 7A. We wrapped that up, and we're actually on to different types of learning. So today, we're actually going to be talking about a very important type of learning that you have probably heard about, that you have probably toyed with the idea of and that's classical conditioning. So I don't know about you, Phil, but I find classical conditioning really interesting because it helps us really understand just kind of why at our very base, we respond to things the way we respond. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about just like social responses in the past and, you know, these more complex ideas, but here we're really getting to the basics of it today.
You're speaking like a behaviorist there, for sure. The reason I really like classical conditioning is because I have a dog. I think most people know I have my dog Millie, named after the discoverer of the electron, Millikan. And like classical conditioning, like the classic version of classical conditioning is Pavlov's dog. And it turns out I feel like this works really well with dogs in general. And so I use conditioning all the time with my dog, trying to get them to do things. Also, like it's kind of fun to do experiments with like people and try to get them to do different things. I don't know if you've seen that episode of The Office where Jim trains Dwight to like crave a Tic Tac every time he hears the computer start via classical conditioning. And I'm like, it's like such a funny episode there.
This would have been the perfect episode for you to introduce us to Millie.
Yeah. That would have been great. She is napping though, because that's what she does. Hard work. Not really. Just she's got like an hour of like, let's go for a walk. And then after that, she's done. But
fair.
Yeah. I've kind of already kind of like introduced this Pavlov scenario, but we should actually talk about Pavlov's dog and Pavlov's experiment. And so what Pavlov did, he noticed that anytime he fed his dog, that the dog would drool, and like anytime he like got some food out, like the dog would start to salivate, and like, you know, drops of spit would come from its mouth, which sounds really gross. But if you have a dog, you're like, yeah, that's a thing. And what he did is he did this experiment where he started to ring a bell every time he fed his dog, and so that his dog would associate the bell with food. And then eventually he was able to just ring a bell without actually providing any food, and just by ringing a bell, the dog would start to salivate, and there was no food. And it's weird because the bell wouldn't normally have any effect on any like dog, but somehow this dog had been trained so that anytime the bell rang, the dog would salivate. And it's like this famous experiment. It's probably one of the most famous experiments in psychology, just overall, is Pavlov's dog.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's one of those things where I think even if you don't really understand classical condition, you might have heard of this experiment, right? So, you know, this might be actually something that when you're thinking about how to study for the MCAT and review these concepts, this might be something that might be just fun to talk about with your friends and talk about with people, even if they don't know, you know, about the MCAT, as a great way to practice and make sure that you really understand the types of conditioning. So you mentioned this bell. And you mentioned the salivation and the food, right? So it's kind of important to think about what these actually are in terms of like the specific terms that we use for classical conditioning. And so you noted that first, right? The dog was responding just to food. And so this food produced this innate response in the dog, in Pavlov's dog, that didn't require any kind of training. And so the food was an unconditioned stimulus. It didn't require any conditioning. It produced an innate response. And it was the stimulus for that response. And then the stimulus, the response produced by the stimulus, right, was the salivation. And so when it was produced by the unconditioned stimulus, it was an unconditioned response. So just right, the two unconditions are paired together. And then you introduce this idea of the bell. And so, like you said, at first, bell's not really going to do a whole lot, right? It's not going to produce that inherent, that same inherent response. And so it was a neutral. stimulus at first, right? But you started pairing it, or Pavlov started pairing it with this unconditioned stimulus that does produce a response. And so eventually, as the bell, as this neutral stimulus gains the ability to produce a response, it becomes a conditioned stimulus. And so you conditioned the response. So then the bell, right, is now paired, the conditioned stimulus is now paired with the conditioned response, the same as the salivation, right? What's really interesting, and I heard this, and this might be some homework for listeners to do. I had heard that the actual composition of the saliva between the two responses might be different. And so maybe we can, it's kind of curious to think about. So maybe, some viewers can actually let us know, do some research and let us know whether there's actually any merit to that claim. Although you might not want to go into too deep of a dive.
Maybe you can do some research on your own. If you have a dog and a mass spectrometer, maybe you can let us know. I feel like that's a very niche audience group of like people who listen to the podcast who have a dog and also just a mass spectrometer. But I'd be up for hearing that data.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, like kind of an interesting thing. I wonder if there's like something like maybe smell activates like certain enzymes. And so without the smell, maybe like it's just a little bit different. But yeah.
I suspect, because if you think about it, like it might be like you said, the smell, but taste is one of those really interesting senses that we have such strong responses to. Like you think about like taste aversion, if you get food poisoning, like it's so intense. And it's really hard to eat a food that you've gotten food poisoning from. So maybe there was something tied with that, but it's a really interesting thought. So basically just kind of quick recap. So we had neutral, right? And that was just the bell before it produced a response. Then we had the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response, which was just the food producing an innate response of the salivation. And then when paired with the food, the bell became conditioned stimulus, producing a conditioned response of salivation. Now, what does it really mean for this to start happening? And what happens if you don't keep pairing the two?
Yeah, there's definitely something kind of interesting there. But I do kind of want to pause just for a second. This like unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, like neutral stimulus, conditioned response. Those terms are really key for anyone taking the MCAT, because it's really easy to make a multiple choice question with those as answers. And so you need to be very good at kind of pulling those apart. Now, something that I've like, if you're paying very close attention, you'll notice that the conditioned response and the unconditioned response are always the same thing. It's like salivation, right? In the case of Pavlov. And so if they ever ask you, like, in a question, like doing a backflip was an example of what? And like you have conditioned response and unconditioned response as answer choices, you can immediately cross them both off, because anything that is one of them will also be the other. And so just like a little bit of, question hacking there, of just recognizing that both responses have to be the same. It's just what caused it. Was it something that happened innately, like just meat, or was it something that happened under conditioned stimulus or under a conditioned environment, which would be like the bell? But yeah, it's super, super interesting here. And I think that this is something that, like, I don't know if Azaii, if you have a lot of these, like, there are things that I notice, like whenever I get in my car and if I drive back to my parents, like all of a sudden I get a craving for fast food, because there's like this one place that I used to always stop at. And so now just like driving near there makes me want fast food. And it's like this thing that's kind of occurring there. And it's because when I was younger, anytime I drove through this town, I'd always get fast food. And so now it's just like seeing the town makes me start to salivate, kind of like Pavlov's dog. And even if I'm like not hungry, all of a sudden I want it. And so like, as you were saying, like there's this like developing this process is called acquisition as you start to get trained on this thing overall. And that's something that can occur over time. There's certain ones that can occur a little bit faster. I think things, as you mentioned, related to taste and smell, like we have just such strong responses to those. And so like, if you want to get like train something like a person or yourself or an animal, a pet, like kind of focusing on those sorts of things tends to make it work a little bit faster. Just because we have this like strong biological urge thing kind of going on beneath there. And then there's also the process of extinction, which is as these things start to go away. And like extinction is like, so if we like the process of acquisition is the process of, for example, getting Pavlov's dog to drool when I ring the bell. Extinction is if I kept ringing the bell and then just never gave the dog food, then eventually that bell, like the dog's going to be like, okay, that doesn't mean anything. And the dog's going to stop drooling in that case. And so that is the process of extinction, of it just kind of going away. I wish that I had better control over this, that I could like make that fast food urge go away, just because it's probably not good. And just as a side note, my sister and I had a discussion like a year ago about, it was actually a year and a day ago at this point, about because there's a very defined date here. I was talking to her about how sometimes I felt like it might be easier to quit something completely than to try to just step down, because like if I say I want to eat less fast food, then like every time I drive by, I'm like, oh, should I have this? Like, oh, I want to eat less. But like, there's still, I'm like, I'll start to like rationalize. But if I just go like, no, I'm just not eating fast food anymore. Like that's so much easier psychologically because I don't have to have that debate in my head. And so my sister and I we're having this debate on this, and we decided to do an experiment. We're like, all right, we're both going to quit fast food just to see who can go the longest. And yesterday was our 1-year anniversary of that. Of just like, okay, we haven't had fast food in over a year. And so it's weird though, because I still drive through that town, and like that's the only time I ever want fast food is when I drive through that town. I'm like, oh, no, I'm not doing fast food anymore. But so I wish that would become extinct a little bit faster. But it's kind of funny how we develop these relationships here.
I mean, first, kudos to you to be able to do that. Like that takes strength. Yeah. Like, and also though, I mean, I can only just imagine like knowing how there's this like, loving fat, like really enjoying fast food sometimes, and also knowing it's not good for you. So I imagine like there are also plenty of other benefits, but I also imagine like there must be a really great benefit of like knowing that you can do something like that, even with like all of these stimuli being like, yep, you're going to start craving. But it's funny that you mentioned that, because I have a similar experience with, I lived a little further south, closer to a more like busy area of the city last year with some friends, and we had developed, I never what's the term in English? This is not a paid announcement. This is not a sponsorship. There we go. So I was never a fan of like McDonald's growing up. And like in terms of fast food, my parents very much were the, we have food at home kind of situation. And if we did like eat out somewhere, usually wasn't like a McDonald's or something like that. Unless, like you were rushing through. And then I moved right across the street from a McDonald's. Mm-hmm. And so, like, mind you, even in undergrad, like I wasn't, big on McDonald's or anything like that. And one of my roommates at the time, he and his sister used to go to McDonald's a lot. That was their thing. And we started going to McDonald's. And so there used to be this like late night response that we would have. We'd get stressed or something, or, we just want to spend time together. And it was like, oh, like, let's go on a McDonald's run, right? In the middle of the pandemic, you can't really do a whole lot, but you can go across the street to like get some fast food and come back. And so, I moved out, and, they're now gone. So there's no reason to return to that area unless you're like, doing like grocery shopping or something like that, or like catching the bus. And every so often I'll pass by it on my like walk back from the hospital. I'm like, should go and get some McDonald's. And I'm like, wait a second, no. Like, so similar to you having that response, like I have it just like walking back every so often. It's a hard one to. Yeah.
And I think that this is why like conditioning is so interesting. I know a lot of people are like, oh, this is like some weird experiment with the dog. Like, no, this helps us understand why we act this way, and why we have like cravings for certain things, and why we develop habits in certain ways. And I know that like pretty much everyone out there has like some things that they wish that they did differently, right? Like I wished I exercised more. I wished I quit eating fast food. I wish that I would not eat after 10 o'clock, or like 9 o'clock or 7 o'clock or whatever. But like everyone has these things. And kind of tying into what we were talking about before, a lot of these kind of revolve around food because it's really easy to develop those conditioned like responses around food because it's just a very powerful motivator, like psychologically. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing overall. If anybody's out there struggling with this, like realizing like, oh, maybe there's like a trigger for this. Like there's actually like some stimulus that you don't even know. Like me seeing the street sign for Smithville, like anytime I see that, like all of a sudden I crave fast food. I'm like, that seems like a weird thing, but it's because I've created this Pavlovian connection there with like this sign causes this response. And so just kind of recognizing that like a street sign might make you crave fast food is like, that's kind of a weird thing, but it makes sense if you start to understand classical conditioning kind of overall.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things that can make it really tricky is this idea of spontaneous recovery. So you talked about extinction, right? And you're like, okay, I wish that this craving would die out and become extinct a little bit faster. But one of the difficult situations with this is that even if, right, you like going back to Pavlov's dog. So, Pavlov starts ringing the bell without bringing in food. So eventually the response, right, becomes extinct. But one day Pavlov might ring the bell and bring some food again. And that response is spontaneously recovered. And so it's a lot easier to, in a sense, learn it the second time. Right. And that's what makes breaking a lot of these bad habits hard. You might like be able to stay away from them for a while, but then like you might slip back into it because you like relearn it after, some spontaneous recovery or something like that. And so that just makes what you're doing all the more impressive. But it's this idea that this is like, there are reasons as to why certain things are so difficult for us to do. And it's really easy to, like you said, kind of beat up on ourselves and be like, I know better. Right. And it's like, okay, you might know better, but your body is still like wired a certain way. And so you're having to overcome that wiring, those innate responses and those learned responses at the same time. And it's tough, but it's doable.
Yeah, that's like, just kind of hitting this idea. I didn't really think about it this way, but absolutely this, like you go a year without eating fast food and like you kind of like kick that habit, right? Like so you don't even really want it. But then all of a sudden, you get fast food one time and that can like immediately restart this because of this spontaneous recovery. And so that's why it's a little bit tricky there of like, this, like, and that's why originally I was making this argument to my sister of that, it's almost easier to just go like quit. Like I think that if I said I just want to cut back on fast food, I would probably be the exact same as where I was when I said that a year ago. But because I'm like, no, we're just not going to do it. Like I don't have to worry about that and think about that. And it kind of prevents that like spontaneous recovery of like sliding back into where you were before. But definitely kind of an interesting thing there. If anybody's out there struggled with something and then, gone back to the way they were before after a lot of effort, right? Like that's always so frustrating. Like I tried so hard to change the way that I acted. And then I just like slipped back to normal. And that's just because you have this recovery of your habits there.
Out of curiosity, did you both like quit cold turkey, or was the part of the argument that one of you would do it one way and the other?
No, that would have been a better experiment, but we just decided both cold turkey.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah. So since yesterday was a year, we've been debating on like, how do we ramp it up? Like, how do we make it a bigger thing? And so we're like, okay, no gas station food. And I feel like 10 years from now, just because my sister and I are very competitive, we're going to be in a scenario that's like only food you catch and eat yourself and like cook yourself and grow yourself. And like, I'm going to be out there with like a grasshopper, like hanging out of my mouth because I'm starving to death.
What you could totally do? Get one of those little, like have them like one of those like growing lamps. And then just grow your own veggies. That's something that I was talking with my dad about the other day, because I gave him some aloe plant and he like, has been flourishing. He's going to transfer it. And so that's something y'all could do.
that's something that would be a good Christmas present. It's I feel like some grow lamps, but then that might put me on a list somewhere if I order a whole bunch of grow lamps for all of my family and that sort of thing. But
so then how would you, so just kind of thinking about it, like, do you respond the same way to all fast food, only some fast food? Is it something you generalize, or are you?
It's definitely only certain kinds. And like, I know that people have different, and this really comes down to like the conditioning there. I don't think I've ever craved fast food Mexican, like Taco Bell and stuff like that. Like never really kind of pulled me in, because I feel like whenever I got Mexican food when I was younger, it was like a real Mexican restaurant. Not to slam Taco Bell, but I'm slamming Taco Bell. Not a sponsorship. Yeah.
Curious to see just how far the ideas of like generalization, discrimination applied to like what you craved, right?
Yeah.
With that street sign.
Yeah, and so those are some new terms here, and this is stuff that happens within conditioning. So generalization is like, so for Pavlov's dog, right? The bell would make the dog drool, and for like, if it was a very generalized scenario, what would happen is like the doorbell, like the church bell, like a bell on TV, like I'm listening to a song that has a bell in it, like that's going to make my dog drool in this case. And so it's not like this one specific thing, but it's kind of like spread to like lots of different stimuli, kind of all cause this same response. And the opposite of that is something that is highly discriminated, and like discrimination, not like, like I don't like you because you're different sort of thing. But discrimination is in like just telling the difference between things. And that's what discrimination really means, is like focusing on differences. And so if the Pavlovian response is highly discriminated, then it's really just a specific stimulus that caused this, like just this one bell, for example, could cause this response. There is a really famous experiment that the MCAT is likely to test you on. It's not quite as famous as the Pavlov experiment, but this is another experiment that is really famous, and the MCAT is very likely to test you on this. I know they've tested on this in the past, and that is the Little Albert experiment. And so with the Little Albert experiment, what they did is they took this baby, Little Albert, I think like was like 1 or 2, somewhere in that range. And what they did is they showed Little Albert a rat, and it was a white fluffy rat. And like Little Albert didn't particularly respond, and like wasn't afraid of it, was kind of interested by it. It's kind of an interesting fuzzy little creature. I feel like a lot of us hate rats, but that might just be because of how we're socialized, to throw back to our one of our previous lectures. And so the rat was essentially a neutral stimulus for Little Albert. It didn't really cause a particular response. And so what they did is they took like some pots and pans and just like slammed them together and made a whole bunch of really loud, startling noises, and Little Albert would start to cry. And so that is this unconditioned stimulus with like the pots and pans, and then the crying is the conditioned response, or the unconditioned response. And so what they did is, after that, they started showing Little Albert the white rat, and then slamming the pots and pans together and creating this new association between this rat and the pots and pans and the loud, scary noise. And so eventually Little Albert would start to cry anytime he saw the rat, just like the dog would salivate anytime it heard a bell. But this experiment was kind of interesting because it created some unintended side effects. Like all of a sudden, Little Albert was afraid of not just rats, but anything white and fluffy. So it had become highly generalized. So he was afraid of white blankets and cotton balls and Santa Claus. And just like anytime he saw anything white and fluffy, he would start to cry and go through this. And it's this kind of famous experiment for the Pavlovian response. But also we talk about it a lot now with just in terms of ethics, like we're like traumatizing a kid to be afraid of Santa Claus and white blankets and cotton balls. Like that seems like probably not the most ethical experiment, but it is one that's kind of interesting overall, because not only is it interesting, but it's also, I think, high yield enough for you to see questions on it on the MCAT. So that makes it extra interesting to the people who are listening to the podcast. Do you have any thoughts on that? It's kind of an
Yeah, I'm
interesting.
wishing I had worn a Santa Claus hat with one of those white, fluffy little
Yeah.
cotton tips. Yeah, so I think it might be helpful for some folks. I know that I'm someone who I do like a lot of recaps, and so that's something that I find helpful. So in case there are folks out there who would find a recap helpful, we gave 3 different examples and 2 very similar in our cases, examples of some classical conditioning, right? So we already talked through Pavlov's dog. And we talked through all of the terms in terms of the Pavlov's experiment, in terms of ours, right? So we both have an association with specific places with fast food. And I think in both of our cases sound like our responses were very specific in terms of what places we were interested in. But in Phil's case, right, like his experience with it is more focused on the like extinction, right? And in your case, avoiding the spontaneous recovery. In my case, right, I was more interested in is it just this one place? Like, you notice that I mentioned like McDonald's specifically. So high level of discrimination, because I have that one specific place, right? When I walk by this general area that produces this, craving for a specific location. The key, like Phil pointed out though, is that while we have this like preference in terms of the response, the stimulus itself is what we're talking about when we consider discrimination versus generalization, right? So I have like this strip of area that I can walk that will produce the response. But outside of that area, right, not just any area with a McDonald's produces the craving. So it's this specific location. And it sounds like in your case as well, that was the case. So quick recap, neutral stimulus doesn't produce an innate response, right? Then we have the unconditioned stimulus, the food, the location that we're walking by. I would just say like, yeah. No, so the actual eating of the food. So in both cases, it's the food with the unconditioned response. So in this case, salivation, and I guess in our case, it's a little
with food.
Yeah, there's no nice way to put that. And then in terms of the location and the bell, those are the initially neutral responses that become conditioned stimuli, excuse me. See, this is why you have to be careful. So they are initially neutral stimuli, they become conditioned stimuli, and they produce the same conditioned response as the initial one, right? So we're just going to be uncomfy about all of it and just say salivation, right? And then that produces this craving, right? That we continue to experience even when the unconditioned stimulus is not present, right? As long as we have the conditioned stimulus. So walking by that area, hearing the bell, things like that. It's also something that you have with like your phones, right? And the alarms on our phones, the sound, right? And like you respond differently to a fire alarm versus your phone alarm. That's discrimination, right? But you might respond similarly if you bite into a lemon versus if you bite into a lime. And that's some generalization. Same thing with the grapefruit. It's just, super hard. So just playing with those ideas. And I find it helpful to draw like a little box and just like walk through an experiment or like something specific and fill out that box, because it's really easy to get mixed up on the terms. Like you saw, I had to check myself a couple of times, especially because it's like conditioned, unconditioned. They also sound really similar. Just practice writing it out. It's super helpful.
Yeah. And I think that if I was going to do this, like, as a student, I'd focus on habits that like maybe I'm trying to do less, because it's really interesting to like understand kind of what's going on with those. Another one that I like have tried to do is this kind of goes with that like moderation didn't work as well, but just like try to use my phone less to like, like social media, things like that. But there are times like there's something that causes you to grab your phone, like, and then start looking at Reddit or Instagram or whatever it is. And like, I found that like trying to just do that less, like doesn't work, because for some reason, like, I think mostly it's just like, I'm not thinking about something. And like the moment that happens, I grab my phone, and like, it's just like this weird hardwired thing to like, look at social media the moment that your brain is not occupied. So there's something, so in that case, it's almost like the just not thinking about something is an unconditioned, or is the conditioned stimulus, and then grabbing your phone is the conditioned response. And it's just definitely kind of an interesting thing there, because I think everyone has those habits of things like I should do this a little bit less, or I should do this a little bit more, and identifying and understanding those is really critical.
Yeah, and I'm really curious, and this might be a great plug for next podcast. I'm curious as to how the phones would work in terms of operant conditioning. So if you guys want to hear about us talk about that, stay tuned, because we might have to incorporate that into our next podcast.
Yeah. There's the classical conditioning, which is everything we've talked about today. I do want to just take one last second to really hammer something home, because I think a lot of times students get confused about the difference between operant and classical conditioning, and the MCAT writers know this, and so they create these questions that are a little bit tricky. All those terms that we talked about, acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, discrimination, all of those are specifically classical conditioning terms. They're not for operant conditioning. And so you want to kind of like be really careful with this, draw this bright line, because there's something that like might seem like it's applying to this scenario, but the scenario is operant conditioning. And so the answer is no, it's not one of these things, because these things are terms specifically within the realm of classical conditioning. And I've seen that cause a lot of trouble with students. So like draw this bright line in your head, the difference between classical conditioning and everything we've talked about today, and operant conditioning, which we're going to be talking about next week.